Yan, good evening everyone. Yung i-report ko ngayon karugtong lang nung kay Ferlin sa input stage, yung batch control. Batch control are used to manage high volumes of transaction data through a system. Bale, na-report na namin ito nung nakaraan sa chapter 6. Yan, bale yung objective ng batch control is to reconcile output produced by the system with the input originally entered into the system. Bale, itong batch control, hindi lang siya dito sa input stage. Bale, it continues through all phases of the data processing. Yan. For example, in the revenue cycle, sales invoices are gathered together and enter the system at data entry. After each subsequent processing stage in the system, the batch is reviewed for completeness. Bale, parang nire-run siya palagi. Run control. Bale, palagi siyang chine-check kung tama yung mga na-entry na data. Yan. And for completeness. An important element of batch control is the batch transmittal sheets. Yun nga yung nilalaman nun, bale, mga relevant information nun, ayan, nandyan. A unique batch number, yan. A batch date, a transaction code indicating the type of transaction such as sales order or cash receipt. The number of records in the batch, record count, the total dollar value of the financial field, batch control total, saka yung the total of a unique non-financial field, hash total. Bale, mamaya sa testing batch controls, malalaman natin kung gaano ka-relevant yung mga yan. The information contained in the transmittal sheet is entered as a separate control record that the system uses to verify the integrity of the batch. The task of reconciling processing with the control of record provides assurance that all sales invoices and cash receipts record that were entered into the system were processed. Yun nga yung gaya kung sinabi ko kanina. No invoices or cash receipt were processed more than once. All invoices and cash receipt entered into the system are accounted for as either successfully processed or rejected because of error. Yun nga. Yan. Testing batch controls. The failure of batch control to function properly can result in records being lost or processed multiple times. Tests of batch control provide the auditor with evidence relating to the management's assertions of completeness and accuracy. In testing batch controls involves reviewing transmittal records of batches processed throughout the period and reconciling them to batch control log. Yung the auditor needs to investigate out of balance condition to determine the cause. Yung example dito, assume natin na yung batch transmittal record shows 100 sales invoice with a total dollar value of 182,674.87 were entered into the system. Pero yung completed batch log, pinapakita lang dito 96 record were processed with a batch total of 172,834.6. Yung tanong dito, what caused this? Is the problem due to loss or change invoices? Did the data entry incorrectly calculate the batch control totals? Bale, the auditor should be able to obtain answer to these questions by reviewing and reconciling transaction listings, error logs, and logs of resubmitted records. Bale, yung paghanap ng evidence, sobrang siya kasi nga marami kang i-scan, maraming thousand of transaction. Bale, meron ditong example na yung ACL application na modern audit software na capable of searching log files for out of balance conditions. Yun nga, gumagamit ng ACL o yung audit command language. Yan. Yung batch control totals naman, yung total dollar value of financial fields, also valuable tools in doing IT audits and fraud audits. Yun nga, yung example dito, it is typical in IT audits to download a copy of database or sets of data files from a real-time online system to a microcomputer for analysis and audit procedures by the auditor. Yung isang technique dito for assuring na yung data being downloaded are the same data that are being analyzed and tested to perform batch controls on the live system. Yun nga, which will then be used as control totals for the data loaded on separate system. Thus, throughout the audit processes, the auditor can be assured that the data are the same way by checking totals of the test data against the control totals obtained from the live system. This process is particularly helpful to auditors who use generalized audit software such as ACL kasi yung batch control can serve as one meaning of obtaining custody of evidence in fraud system. Bale, pwede siya maging forensic evidence that can be an effective process for fraud audits. Yun nga. Yung ACL commands such as profile, total, and count will provide the kind of information necessary to adequately develop a set of batch control. And process controls. Process controls include computerized procedure for file updating and restricting access to data. And depending on the level of the computer technology in place, process control may also include physical manual tasks. Yung mamaya explain ko yan. Bale, we begin by examining three control techniques related to file updating. Yung file update controls, transaction code controls, sequence check control. Yan. Tapos sunod, access and physical controls are then examined. Bali, unahin natin yung file update controls. Yan, yung file update controls. Run-to-run controls use batch control data discussed in the previous section to monitor the batch as it moves from one program procedure to another. Yun nga, gaya na nga ng sabi ko kanina, na kada yung batch control, chinecheck siya palagi ba? Kasi once na may discrepancy o may nag-iba sa record, it may indicate that a record was lost in processing or a record in a batch went unprocessed or a record were processed more than once. Yun nga, this controls ensures that each run in the system process the batch correctly and completely. Yun nga, mahalaga yung run-to-run controls sa batch control. Yun, transaction code controls. Revenue cycle systems are often designed to process multiple record types. For example, the record entry application may process both sales, orders, and returns and allowances transaction. The actual task performed by the application ay dinedetermine siya ng transaction code assigned to each record. Errors in transaction codes or in the program logic that interprets them can cause incorrect processing of transaction and may result materially misstated sales and accounts receivable balances. Yun nga, magkakaroon ng materially misstated sa accounts receivable din. Kasi nga, for example, yung payment, cash siya pero nakalagay doon, check. Bali, magkakaroon tayo ng accounts receivable. Basta parang ganun, parang magkakaroon tayo ng it's either overstated accounts receivable or understated accounts receivable. Sequence check control. In the system that uses sequential master files, the order of the transaction records in the batch is critical to correct and complete processing. As the batch moves through the process, it must be resorted in order of the master file used in each run. Yun nga. Bale, yung out of sequence sale order record in the batch may prevent the remaining downstream record from being processed. For example, wala yung sa 1 to 50 wala yung 12, bali yung 13 to 50 hindi siya mapaprocess. Tas yung most serious na problem can occur when sequence error is not detected. The downstream records are processed against the wrong customer accounts. For example, yung 13 naging 12, parang ganun. Tas lahat na nagkamali. Yun nga. A sequence check control should be in place to compare the sequence of each record in the batch with the previous record to ensure that proper sorting took place. Out-of-sequence records should be rejected and resubmitted for subsequent processing to allow the other records in a batch to properly process. Yan. Yan. Testing file update controls. The failure of file update controls to function properly can result in records going unprocessed, being processed incorrectly, or being posted to the wrong customer accounts. Tests of file update controls provide the auditor with evidence relating to the assertion of existence, completeness, and accuracy. Yun nga. Bale, yung test of transaction codes and sequence checks can be performed using ITF or the test data approach. Yung example dito, yung kunwari, yung auditor, ano siya, gagawa siya ng test data na nagko-contain ng incorrect transaction codes, tapos out of sequence in a batch. Tapos i-check niya kung yung system ay i-handle yun ng correctly. Bale, dapat maayos i-handle yun ng system. Parang ganon. The efficient use of logic testing CAATs like ITF requires careful planning. By determining in advance the input and process control to be tested, a single audit procedures can be devised that performs all tests in one operation. For example, a single test designed to examine credit authorization controls, transaction code controls, and the mathematically accuracy of the update program can provide evidence that supports multiple audit objectives. Yan. Yan. Access control. Access control prevent and detect unauthorized and illegal access to the firm's assets. Inventories and cash are the physical assets of the revenue cycle. Traditional techniques used to limit access to this asset includes the following: using warehouse security such as fences, alarms, and guards, depositing cash depositing cash daily in the bank, using a safe or night deposit box for cash, and locking cash drawers and safes in the cash receipts department. Yan. Controlling access to the accounting records is no less important. An individual with unrestricted access to data can manipulate physical assets of the firm and cause financial statements to be materially misstated. Accounting files stored on magnetic media are particularly vulnerable to unauthorized access, whether its cause is accidental or an act of malice by the strangled employee, or an attempt at fraud. The following examples of risk is specific to the revenue cycle. Ito, an individual access to the AR subsidiary ledger could remove his or her account from the books with no record of the account. The firm would not send the customer monthly statements. Yun nga, kunwari merong utang yung kakilala nung may access sa AR subsidiary ledger. Bale, pwede niyang tanggalin yung utang nun na nakarecord sa may yung nakarecord, tapos hindi na siya sasenda ano, ng ng firm ng monthly statements. Yun. Access to blank sales order may enable an authorized individual to trigger the shipment of a product. Yun. An individual with access to both cash and accounting records could remove cash from the firm and cover the by adjusting the cash account. Yun nga, bale parang pumapasok din dito yung segregation of duties para maayos yung access control. Yan. Individual with access to physical inventories and inventory records could steal products and adjust the records to cover the theft. Yun nga. Ito yung testing access controls para ma-test natin kung kung maayos ba kung hindi ba nangyayari yung mga kanina yung mga example ng risk. Access control is the is at the heart of accounting information integrity. In the absence of controls, invoices can be deleted, added, or falsified. Individual account balances can be erased, or the entire AR file can be destroyed. Evidence gathered about the effectiveness of access control tests, the management assertion of existence, completeness, accuracy, evaluation and allocation, right and obligation and presentation, and disclosure. Yan. Computer access controls are both system-wide and application-specific. Access control over revenue cycle application depends on effective controlling access to the operating systems and the networks and the database which they interact. The control techniques discussed in previous chapters, yun nga na-discuss na yung na-discuss na yung mga control dito para ma maiwasan yung risk kanina na sinabi ko. Yun nga yung including yung passwords, data encryption, firewalls, and user views apply also in preventing unauthorized access to revenue cycle processes. The auditors will typically test these controls as part of their review of general controls. Yun nga, bali, yun lang yung tinetest ng mga internal auditor, yung password, data encryption, kung maayos ba. Yung mga yun, kasi once na may error doon ay may mali, magkakaroon ng risk kasi nga 'di ba yung testing access control, pag maayos yung pag-test mo ng access control, halos lahat ng management assertion dito bali mas pag maganda yung access control mo, mas maganda yung mapaprovide ng internal auditor na report. Yan, physical controls. Yung physical controls meron siyang tatlo. Segregation of duties, supervision, independent verification. Yan, yung sa segregation of duties. Proper segregation of duties ensures that no single individual or department processes a transaction in its entirety. The number of employees in the organization and volume of the transactions being processed will influence how tasks are divided. Yan, in general, the following three rules apply. Yung rule number 1, transaction authorization should be separate from transaction processing. For example, within the revenue cycle, the credit department is segregated from the rest of the process so that formal authorization of material transaction is an independent event. The importance of this separation is clear when one considers the potential conflict in objectives between the individual salespersons and the organization. Often, sales staff compensation is based on their levels. To achieve their personal objective of maximizing sales volume, sales personnel may not always consider the creditworthiness of the prospective customer. The credit department, acting as an independent authorization group, detects risky customers and discourages poor and irresponsible sales decisions. And yung rule number 2, asset custody should be separate from the record-keeping task. In the sales order system, the inventory warehouse clerk with custody of physical asset should not maintain the inventory records. Similarly, the cash receipt clerk should not record accounts receivable. Yan. Rule number 3, the organization should be structured that the perpetration of fraud requires collusion between two or more individuals. The record-keeping function must be carefully divided. Specifically, the subsidiary ledger, AR and inventory, the journals, sales and cash receipt, and the general ledger should be separately maintained. An individual with total record-keeping responsibility in collusion with someone with asset custody is in a position to perpetrate fraud. By separating these tasks, collusion must involve more people, which increases the risk of detection and is therefore less likely to occur. Yun nga, sinabi nga dito, mas maraming involved na people sa gagawin nilang fraud. Kahit mag-usap-usap pa sila, mahirap pa rin parang mas mabilis madedetect kasi nga maraming involved. Siyempre, di naman mawawala yung chismoso sa ano. Basta ganun. Yan, next is yung supervision. Some firms may have two employees to achieve adequate separation of function and must rely on supervision as compensating control. By closely supervising the employees who perform potentially incompatible function, a firm can compensate for the exposure inherent in a system. Yun. Supervision can provide control in systems that are properly segregated. For example, the mailroom is a point of exposure for any firm. The individual who opens the mail has access to both cash and the remittance advice, the record of the transaction. A dishonest employee may use this opportunity to steal the check, cash it, and destroy the remittance advice, thus having no evidence of the transaction. Ultimately, this sort of fraud will come to light when the customer receives another bill and, in response, produces the cancelled check. However, by the time the firm gets to the bottom of this problem, the perpetrator may have committed the crime many times over and left the organization. Detecting crimes after the fact accomplishes little. Prevention is the best solution. The deterrent effect of supervision can provide effective preventive control. Yun nga, yung supervision, bali sinasabi lang dito, syempre hindi naman, ano, 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 sa isang firm, hindi naman maraming employee. Minsan, walang mahanap na compatible dun sa position na yun. Bale, yung ibang matagal na sa company, ginagawa nila yung dapat incompatible function. Bale, parang may tiwala na lang, bale kumukuha na lang yung firm ng isang parang supervisor para bantayan yung mga ginagawa ng mga employee na merong incompatible task para para magkaroon lang ng ng effective preventive control sa mga risk na maaring magawa nung isang employee na yon. Independent verification. The purpose of independent verification is to review the work performed by others at the key junctures in the process to identify and correct errors. Following are two examples in the revenue cycle. The shipping department verifies that the goods sent from warehouse are correct in type and quantity before the goods are sent to the customer. The stock release document and the packing slip are reconciled to identify discrepancies. The billing department reconciles the shipping notice with the sales invoice to ensure that the customers are billed only for the item and quantities that were actually shipped. Madali lang naman yung independent verification eh. Testing physical controls na tayo. Testing physical controls. Inadequate segregation of duties and lack of effective supervision and independent verification can result in fraud and material errors. Exposure issues here are similar to access control issues discussed earlier. Yun nga, bale, yung ginagawa ng internal auditor para ma-check o ma-test yung sa segregation of duties, nire-review niya yung job description and organizational charts, and by observing physical processes should disclose and more egregious example of incompatible tasks. Tapos, chine-check niya rin kung merong kung yung organization merong rules appropriately dealing with nepotism issues. Parang yung nepotism issues yung mga employee merong relationship, para merong magjowa dun sa sa isang firm. Tapos meron silang yung task nila incompatible parehas. Siyempre pwede silang magkaroon ng usapan kasi nga magkaroon in relationship silang dalawa. Tapos pwede silang mag-commit ng fraud And many tasks that are normally segregated in manual systems are consolidated in the data processing function of computer-based systems. Yan, yung computer program in the revenue cycles, nagpe-perform ng inventory control, accounts receivable, billing, and the general ledger. Bale, in this situation, yung auditor, mas concerned siya at dapat mag-focus sa, integrity ng computer programs that perform this task. Yan. The following questions need answers. Is the logic of computer program correct? Has anyone tampered with the application since it was last tested? Have changes made to the program that could have caused undisclosed error? Yan. Answer to this question come to the auditor's review of system development and maintenance control. And by reviewing organizational structure, recall from earlier chapters the duties pertaining to the design, maintenance, and operation of computer programs need to be separated. Yun yung na-report natin, yung mga segregation of duties din. Yung programmers who write the original computer programs should not be responsible for making program changes. Also, individuals who operate the computer system should not be involved in system design, programming, and maintenance activities. Yun nga kasi nga magkakaroon ng fraud. Pag kasi incompatible task kasi yun eh. Yan. Tas yung personal relationships, example, marriage between individuals in this incompatible areas may require further investigation. Yan. Output controls. Output controls are designed to ensure that information is not lost, misdirected, or corrupted, and that system processes function as intended. Yun nga. Kasi once na magkaroon ng mali dito sa output controls, it can result na financial loss sa firm. Yan. For example, managers receive daily summaries of sales order placed by customers, goods shipped, and cash received, and such data to monitor the status of their operations. Output control can be designed to identify potential problems. For example, an exception report derived from the customer open order file listing end of day open sales order can identify orders placed but not shipped. Such report can help management assess the operation performance in the shipping process. Yun nga. Reconciling the general ledger is an output control that can detect certain types of transaction processing errors. For example, yung total ng all credit sales recorded by the billing, dapat equal siya sa yung total increases posted to the AR subsidiary account. A sales transaction that is entered in the journal but not posted to the customer's account would be detected by the imbalance in the general ledger. The specific cause of an out-of-balance condition could not be determined at this point, pero manonoted na siya. Finding the error may require examining all of the transaction. Ito, pwede siyang this could be time-consuming. For this reason, rather summarizing the entire day transaction in a single batch, entities, ginagroup nung entity yung mga transaction ng small batches of 50 to 100 items para mas ma-facilitate yung pag-reconcile ng balances by isolating a problem to a specific batch. Yun nga. Another important element of output control is the maintenance of audit trail. Yan. Example of audit trail output controls. Accounts receivable change report. This is a summary report that shows the overall changes to accounts receivable from sales order and cash receipt. These numbers should be reconciled with total sales, cash receipt on account, and the general ledger. Bale, ano lang yun eh. Test ng completeness, parang ganon. Kasi, chine-check natin kung yung record ng sales, meron siyang sales order, parang ganon. Yung sa transaction log. Every transaction successfully processed by the system, ano yun, should be recorded on transaction log. Yung transaction log, siya, nagsiserve siya na as a journal. It serves two purposes. First, yung transaction log is a permanent record of valid transaction. The original transaction file produced at the data input phase is usually only a temporary file. Once na na-process yung record, yung file may erase na siya to make room for a next batch of transaction. Second, yung not all records are temporary transaction files will always be successfully processed. Some of these records may fail validity tests and will be rejected. Transaction log should contain only successful transactions. Rejected transactions should be placed in an error file. The transaction log and error files combined should be account for all transactions in the batch. Validated transaction file may then be scratched with no loss of data. Yan, yun sa transaction listing. The system should produce a hard copy transaction listing of all successful transaction. Yan. This listing should go to the appropriate user to facilitate with the input. For example, listing of cash receipt process will go to the controller to be used for a bank reconciliation. Yun lang yan. Log of automatic transaction. Some transactions are triggered internally by the system. Yun nga, na-report ko na rin ito nakaraan eh. Bale, yung mismo system yung nagta-transaction. Bale, kunwari, yung inventory, na siya, mababa na. Bale, automatic na gagawa ng order yung system para para mapunan yung siyempre hindi naman na-check kung kulang na talaga yung inventory minsan. Bale, yung system na yung gumagawa nag-automatic na umu-order dun sa supplier. Bale, yung ginagawa lang nun, nagkakaroon na siya ng log ng mga automatic transaction para ma-check ng authorized person kung lahat ng mga internally triggered transactions ng system. Unique transaction identifier. Each transaction processed by the system must be uniquely identified with a transaction number. Parang lang to, account number. This control is only practical means of tracing particular transaction through a database of thousands, even millions of records. Yun nga, parang account number lang siya para mas madali siya ma-identify. Kunwari, account number ko sa kunwari student number ko 2018. Bale, isi-search lang yung 2018 tapos lalabas na yung pangalan ko. Parang mas mapapadali maghanap o mag-search ng transaction ng isang data kung meron siyang unique transaction. Parang unique transaction identifier. Yan, yung error listing. A listing of errors record should go to appropriate user to support error correction and submission. Bale, yung mga, di ba sa transaction log, yung mga successful transaction lang yung napaprocess. Bale, yung mga error files dito na pupunta sa error listing. Bale, para ma-correct sa ma-resubmit. Testing output controls. The absence of adequate output controls has adverse implication of operational efficiencies and financial reporting evidence. Evidence gathered through tests of output controls relates to the completeness and accuracy assertion. Test of output controls involves reviewing summary reports for accuracy, completeness, timeliness, and relevance to the decision that they are intended to support. In addition, the auditor should trace sample transaction through audit trails report, including transaction listing, error logs, and logs of resubmitted records. Gathering evidence, however, may involve sorting through thousands of transactions. Bale, in modern systems, audit trails are usually stored in online text data extraction software such as ACL. Yun nga, yung ACL na application can be used to search log files for specific records to verify completeness and accuracy of output reports. Bale, merong ginagamit yung mga internal auditor na app para mas mabadali sila kasi nga thousand of transaction yung ititignan nila para ma-check yung output controls. Bale, mas mapapadali sila kung gagamit sila ng app. A well-designed ITF system will permit the auditor to produce a batch of sample transaction including some error records and trace them through all phases of processing, error detection, and output reporting. Yun lang. Thank you. Next reporter na po si Erica Agustin.